starting my tour here in front of St. Phillips Episcopal Church, Episcopal being the American word for Anglican. You would have heard its carillon and chimes playing just before. This is the traditional social political heart of Charleston. And something to keep in mind as we walk through this city is that there are lots of differences in the reasoning behind various American colonies and why they were founded. You've got Boston and Pennsylvania. These places were founded for religious freedom for the Quakers and the Puritans. You've got cities like New York that were founded by merchant adventurers looking to make a quick buck. You've got Savannah, Georgia, which was founded as a philosophical ideal colony. But Charleston is none of those. It was founded very specifically as a kind of royal colony that would replicate the social and establishment mores coming from England. And the founding date is very important, 1670. We're in the middle of the Restoration, that period after the Interregnum and the Civil War where Charles II is restored to the throne. And so there's a great concern in the colonies at that time of replicating the kind of social structures and cultural structures back in England rather than allow religious freedom and all sorts of other kind of experiments in democracy that seem to have gone so wrong during the English Civil War. And so as a result, the Anglican Church is, of course, the center of the colony. This particular church was built in the 1840s. It's a later version, but the original church was built here in 1680, and membership of the Anglican Church was a sign that you were part of the social elite of Charleston. Everyone who was anyone was expected to be a member. So there's always been a site, Episcopal church on this site. It's been rebuilt several times over the years. This particular incarnation, though, from the 1840s, easily the tallest building in the city. In fact, by law, nothing can be taller than it. Stuart will be able to show you a slide that shows it in the cityscape. Because it was the tallest building in the city in the 19th century, it was often used as a lighthouse to guide ships into the harbor and various other kind of maritime functions. And kind of solidifying its purpose as a social center of the colony and a political center, the original South Carolina Assembly sat in the pews when it met, and the governor of South Carolina initially had his office on the second floor of the church. Obviously, these functions have moved away. On the other side of the church is the cemetery. It's a churchyard next to the church, obviously, and then a larger cemetery on the other side of the street. In this cemetery, you can see all sorts of beautiful live southern oaks. We'll see a couple of those as we walk around Charleston. Those classic oak trees that often carry the Spanish moss from their boughs. This is, kind of the classic flora of the South. Live oaks can be found all up and down the Carolina coast. Many of the most prestigious personages of the Carolinas are buried here. There's a large square tomb you might just be able to make out at the back of John C. Calhoun, who was a famous South Carolina politician and the Vice President of the United States. A signer of the Declaration of Independence has been located here as well. So this is the kind of heart, the traditional social center of the colony. We're going to keep moving on a little bit further north now through an area that's known as the French Quarter, and we're going to try and look at some of the oldest parts of Charleston in this part of the city. When it was founded in 1680, there had been a lot of trouble in getting settlers to move to the Carolinas. The Carolinas were swampy, they were dirty, they were humid, they were uncomfortable. Basically, it was not a very desirable place to move in the initial days. The Lords Proprietor of the Carolinas, who were appointed by King Charles II to oversee the development of the colony, and these were generally loyalist friends of the king who had faithfully defended him during the Civil War, and so they were rewarded with this large area of the Carolinas. In doing so, they had to come up with all sorts of interesting stratagems to attract colonists here, including things like giving generous land grants, allowing refugees from other countries to move here. And so the initial settlers actually came from Bermuda. They were religious refusants, people who hadn't fitted in with Bermudan society. They tried living in the Bahamas, they hadn't fit in here as well. And so the first group of settlers under William Sale came here from Bermuda in the 1670s to form what's today Charleston. Just as we're walking by, I want to point out two details just on this ordinary house in the historic district. The first is this plaque. The plaque has the Greek name of Charleston, Carolopolis, from the Greek word for Charles, Carolus, and polis obviously meaning city, the founding date, and of course, in mixing their classical metaphors, the the motto of the city in Latin, which translates as "She guards her temples, customs, and laws." You will see these little black plaques on the side of buildings all around Charleston. I won't obviously point them all out, but if you see one on any building, it means this is a building that was here before the Civil War, and the Charleston Historical Society has identified it as a significant structure. The other little detail I want to point out is this pineapple door knocker. The pineapple is kind of the unofficial symbol of Charleston. It means hospitality. Now, pineapples don't grow in the Carolinas. In fact, they only really grow in Florida. But the pineapple was a symbol of hospitality in Carolinas because it was a city of merchant traders and adventurers who would sail all around the Caribbean and the Americas, trading with the southern colonies of the Americas and bringing up fresh goods to the north. One of the rarest and most valuable things you could bring back was a pineapple. And if you had them and served them to your guests in your house, that was the symbol that you held your guests in great esteem and that you were willing to pay good money to make sure they were happy. And so it became all the rage in the 19th century to give pineapples out to guests, so much so that it's now kind of an unofficial symbol of Charleston and Southern hospitality. This large pink building that we're now in front of is the French Huguenot Church. Now, I mentioned the Lord Proprietors. They needed various stratagems in order to attract people to the colonies. And so in the 1680s, one of the solutions they came up with was giving a certain degree of religious freedom to people who moved here, even though this was not the original intent of the colony. In order to attract people, this was a strategy they employed. One of the groups that they gave amnesty to were the French Huguenots. Huguenots were followers of John Calvin, Protestants, French Protestants, and they had a long and complicated history in France of both being persecuted and tolerated at different stages. In the 1500s, the Edict of Nantes in the 1580s, this had sort of kept French Protestants in the circle in France, but Louis XIV, when he came to the throne, rescinded this edict and basically started persecuting French Protestants in the 1670s. As a result, it was deemed politically expedient for Charles II and the British government to give amnesty to these refugees and get them out of France. Except they had a problem. As I said, it's a very touchy subject in England in the Restoration period to accept anyone who doesn't follow the Church of England. So they came up with a great solution. They said, we'll send them to these unbearable colonies, we'll give them their own church or whatnot, and they can help get it started. So the original 45 that Charles II came out formed their own church here. I have a slide showing what it looks like in the inside and the very distinctive French Huguenot cross. That original group of 45 eventually developed into a large French Protestant community here in Charleston. So there are many French names in Charleston that come from these original families that moved here. And the Huguenots played a large role in the development of the city. And it's sometimes some of the sort of Southern traditions and Southern hospitality and politeness also descends from French traditions. Things like silver patterns, which every South Carolina family have, are a French tradition. So there's a lot of influence from there. As we walk a little bit up further, we'll cross the street, you can see one of the first theatres in the Americas, the Dock Street Theatre. A French design, by and large. You can see the French-style ironwork on the upper balconies and the elaborate decorative motifs that are French in style around the top of the columns. Theatre, as you might recall, was a big part of the Restoration. The Puritans had banned a lot of plays and theatre in England during the Interregnum, and so Charles II thought it was very important that plays be prominently shown in the new colony of Charleston to kind of indicate the royal authority and the loosening of Puritan mores. However, it wasn't always a theatre. The Dock Street Theatre has moved around, and this building before the Dock Street Theatre moved back in here was famously the Planters Hotel. Planters Punch, a famous South Carolina drink, was developed here at the hotel. It was also, during the Civil War, the site of one of the most important keepers in Charleston. The Planters Hotel was often where Confederate naval officers stayed while they were docked in port. We're not too far away from the harbour. We'll end our walk up there, and so you'll see how far away we are. But the Dock Street Theatre was originally the Planters Hotel, and so naval officers staying there, while their ships were docked in harbour, there was a particular gunboat that pulled into the harbour in 1863 that happened to have a crew that was staffed by Charlestonians. One of that crew was a man named Robert Smalls, who had actually worked at the Planters Hotel previously as a waiter before becoming a pilot on the ship. So when the officers from the ship went tucked in for the night, Smalls, knowing the hotel quite well, was able to find most of the crew very quickly, get them out of the hotel, find their families around the surrounding districts, run down to the ship, and they hijacked it. They sailed the gunboat right out into Charleston Harbor, managed to get past 4 forts without sounding the alarm, and then ran over to the Union lines and handed the ship over to the Union Navy. This act of daring right in the middle of the war actually helped convince Abraham Lincoln that African Americans could serve in the US Navy, and so Robert Smalls was given a small commission in the US Navy after that. And then after the war, he became the South's first African American congressman from 1870 onwards. So interesting stories associated with the old Planters Hotel and now the Dock Street Theatre again. We're going to walk a little bit further now through the area known as the French Quarter. Lots of small European-style houses here, not all of them dating from the actual French Quarter period. There's been waves of fires and destruction in the city, which has meant that not every house standing here is original. But by and large, most of what you see is a fairly faithful reconstruction, and about half of the buildings here do date from that original French Huguenot population that lived here. As we cross around the corner, we're going to get to the very oldest part of Charleston. You'll be able to see that fairly clearly because it's still got the cobblestone streets underneath. And these very small squat houses that are on the other side of the street. The pink house at the end of the row, which is known as the Pink House, is the oldest building left standing in Charleston. The date associated with this building is most commonly established as 1694. However, historians and archaeologists do debate whether it was actually built in that era, on that date, but this is generally the date that's been agreed on. The Pink House, if it was built in 1694, as most believe, would make it the second oldest house in the United States still standing. There is one older house in Santa Fe, New Mexico, but this would be the oldest residential structure. That being said, it's been used as a pub and very other uses before, so there's dispute about whether it actually should get that designation. The architecture of these very early houses is quite distinctive, especially the use of pastel colors, but also the sort of squat design of the houses, quite short, with these small double sash windows. This is the architecture that actually came from Bermuda. When William Sale and those first colonists arrived from Bermuda, they brought with them the traditional styles of that city. And Stuart can throw up a slide of Bermudian houses today, which still follow this pattern. The only difference is the roofs in Bermuda are white because they use limestone in order to shingle the roofs. That's not really easily available in Charleston, and so they just use tile. There are various other parts of Charleston that still use this Bermudian kind of style, including an area called Rainbow Row, which we won't get to on our walk today, but Stuart can throw up a slide showing that indicates that pastel kind of color scheme that many parts of the city still use as an homage to that early Bermudian influence. We're going to walk now further down this cobblestone street towards one of the true rarities of Charleston, and in fact one of the most unique buildings it has in the context of the greater United States, and that is the old Slave Mart. Now, there are very, very few structures left in the United States that have any association with the slave trade. Most of these were burned down, pulled down, destroyed either by African Americans or the Union Army during or after the Civil War. The association with the slave trade obviously makes it very, very difficult for these structures to survive. This particular one has a complex and sort of interesting history, which means that it does. Now, there aren't a lot of buildings anyway associated with the slave trade, even at the height of slavery, because traditionally all slave auctions occurred in the streets. Charleston was one of the biggest slaving ports in the world, the second largest or the largest in the South, depending on the year you look at. New Orleans sometimes vied with it for domination of the transatlantic slave trade, but as many as 400,000 slaves passed through Charleston during the height of the trade before the Civil War. About 80% of African Americans can trace at least one ancestor to a slave auction here in Charleston. So it's an important kind of origin destination for a lot of African Americans. So most of the slave trade was conducted openly in the streets. You'd have auctions. Initially, at the earliest years of the slave trade, it was just called the scramble. They would bring a whole lot of slaves into a street like this. They would basically put them in pens and allow the buyers to run around and grab whoever they felt was great. Then they'd line up at the end and just pay for them whatever they could haggle out of the dealer. Later, we moved to a slave auction system, still done in the street, but where they would auction off slaves one by one. Then, a little bit later, when the transatlantic slave ended in 1808, there was a little bit more subtlety to the slave trade. It was more difficult to obtain them. And then in 1856, the slave trade was banned from the streets. The reason was largely political. In the heightened period of abolitionism before the Civil War, even Southern politicians feared the optics of having slaves openly sold in the street. So they made a rule and said they must be sold within private premises. And so in that last 4 years before the Civil War, that's where a building like this emerges. This was a fire station that was converted into a slave auction house in 1856. The reason it survives, obviously the Civil War came fairly soon after its establishment. The reason it survives is because instead of being destroyed after the Union Army captured it, they used it temporarily to house African Americans who'd been displaced by the war. It sort of turned into an African American tenement building, which is kind of perverse when you think about it. Then it was abandoned. They didn't quite get around to pulling it down. And then because it had this large open gate, some local investor bought it up and turned it into a car dealership. So if you can imagine, there was a turntable under the arch, and you had Chryslers rotating under the words of the old Slave Mart. And then eventually it was bought up by a woman named Miriam Wilson, who turned it into a museum in 1938. Except bizarrely, she turned it into a museum basically promoting slavery, saying that it was good for African Americans and sort of, warning of the horrors of the Civil War and abolitionism. So this kind of ghastly inversion of a museum lasted until 1959, until political pressure finally forced her to sell up the building. And then after a couple of decades after that, it was turned into an actual museum about the history as a slave mart. So an incredibly rare building in the United States, and still today a very popular museum for many African Americans who use the archives to trace their origins back to the slave trade here, and of course for white tourists as well to learn about the complex history of Charleston. Charleston's history is very complex because it was a large African-American slavery entrepot. At the height of the slave trade in about the 1850s, it was also majority African-American. Fully 57% of Charleston's residents were African-Americans in 1850. That made it a very unusual situation in the United States insofar as there was not a white majority here. That created a lot of tensions in the city. It also created a lot of fear amongst the white population because, of course, they were outnumbered in their own city. And there was a high degree of reliance on African Americans for absolutely everything in the city, not just, to be used as agricultural laborers out in the fields, but they did everything in the city too. They were laundresses, they were clerks, they worked in domestic kitchens and commercial kitchens. So if you were coming here before the Civil War, it would have been, even for Southerners, quite arresting to see the very high degree of African Americans living in the city. We're now going to walk up to the main commercial thoroughfare of central Charleston, Broad Street, and I'll point out a couple of buildings of note here, and then we'll have a little bit of a break from me talking about sites, and we'll be able to get to some of that history and the economics of Charleston. But another building I want to point out before that sits at the top of Broad Street. It's known as the Old Exchange and Provost Dungeon Building. It was built in 1771. So it's a colonial era building. That was the building that initially most of the slave auctions in the city were performed in front of, in the open street and plein air. The building has served many purposes over its history. It was the sort of center of the colonial administration of Charleston for a long period of time. It played a couple of important roles in the early history of Charleston because Charleston was a kind of a marginal settlement. It was on the edge, let's say, of the British Empire. The Carolinas are quite close to Spanish Florida. They're also close to French interests in the Caribbean. Before the Provost was built, there was a powder magazine on here, a public gunpowder magazine, in which people were able to fill their muskets and defend the city at a moment's notice. And that was the expectation if you moved here prior to the 1760s. There could be an attack at any time by the French or Spanish, and so you would come to the old side of the magazine that's now part of the dungeons of this building. You'd load up and then you'd sort of defend the city as much as you could. There was also a bigger threat than that, though, and that was piracy. Pirates were a major part of the history of the Caribbean in this time, and there were two famous pirate attacks in Charleston. The first was, and the biggest, most important one, was in 1718. The infamous pirate Blackbeard came into Charleston Harbor with 4 ships, just 4 ships and 60 cannons, but that made him the biggest navy in the Carolinas and on the eastern seaboard. So he was able to sail into the harbor and hold the city to ransom. They ended up blockading the city for months, basically taking hostages out of all the ships in the harbor and capturing all the cargo. But essentially, the main aim of the city and the reason they held the city on blockade was they wanted a very specific booty or ransom from the governor of the Carolina colonies. And that governor, Robert Johnson, eventually gave up that booty, and it was medicine. One of the rarest things to obtain in the New World were things like syringes and treatments for basic ailments. Blackbeard's crew, they later found out when they exhumed the remains of Queen Anne's Revenge in North Carolina, they found the things that they got from South Carolina, including urethral syringes for the treatment of syphilis, because about half of his crew had it and were, under extreme pain. So Blackbeard his career didn't last much longer after the blockade of South Carolina, but it was successful here. Stead Bonnet, another major pirate, was hung in front of this building in the 1720s. He was captured trying to raid off the Carolina coast too. So it was a big part of its early history, was it was a bit like the Wild West, Charleston in the 1700s. During the American Civil War, the building also played an important role during the American War of Independence. There was a major campaign that was conducted towards the end of the War of Independence called the Southern Strategy, where essentially the British, who had fought things to a kind of stalemate in the North, decided to try and turn the war around by landing in Charleston in the South. The theory went that the Southerners were supposed to be loyalists, and of course, because they were royal colonies and they had a stronger association with the crown than the Americans of the North, there was some basis in history here. And so when they landed here, they expected the population of Charleston to rise up and join the British Army and help overthrow the rebels in the North. That didn't really occur, at least not the way they expected. However, they did capture the city in 1780. It was one of the worst defeats for Washington and the rebellion during the American War of Independence. Most of the British temporary Southern government under Lord General Cornwallis set up in that building, and by and large, they put most of the prisoners there. The Southern strategy didn't work, though. Although they had successes in Charleston and nearby cities, Cornwallis and the British would eventually surrender at Yorktown only 2 years later.
Matthew, just while you're walking down the street, I couldn't help but notice when you happened to mention the Wild West of Charleston, and in your background was a horse-drawn carriage with tourists on it. And I can't help but thinking, are there a lot of tourists around today? Has tourism come back to Charleston?
A little bit. I mean, you can see the streets. They're pretty quiet for, it is only a Tuesday evening. But from what we've been finding, yes, there is a reasonable degree of American tourism, but nowhere near where it's its high water mark. October should be the busiest month in Charleston. This is when the temperature is bearable, although you've probably seen me sweating profusely on camera. But it's much more easy to get around and survive than the summer, and it's a lot less hectic. Most Americans don't necessarily go on holidays around Thanksgiving and Christmas. So for the busiest season of the year, it's still pretty quiet, but there is a reasonable amount of tourism.
Okay, great, thanks. Just while you're walking down the street, I'll just share a couple of key dates with everybody, just on the history of Charleston, just to get a bit of more orientation to fit in with what Matthew's been saying. So basically, the city was founded, it was actually originally founded in 1670, but it was then moved in 1680 to its current site. So everyone considers 1680 as being the site of it. And you've got very distinct periods in Charleston's history. You've got the colonial period from 1680 through to 1774, the Revolutionary War. And the city was a major trading port. It was founded on rivers and it was ease of access for trade. It was the southernmost English colony on the American coast until Georgia, the state of Georgia, was founded. So it was quite a very important, and for trade with the West Indies. And the original trading was primarily with the deer skins, the local Indians' deer skin. They thought they'd be able to grow tobacco. That didn't quite work. And quite bizarrely enough, one of the other trade items was native Indian slaves. So they were enslaved and shipped up to places like Boston or over to the West Indies. And similarly, you had the start of the slave trade coming in from the Bermuda, West Indies, and from Africa. 1698, they had a very bad year in Charleston. They copped a smallpox outbreak, an earthquake, and yellow fever. And they reckon that by the time the smallpox earthquake, by the time yellow fever came, so 15% of the rest of the population was wiped out by yellow fever. Yellow fever actually became such a problem. They had about 7 or 8 major outbreaks of yellow fever that the locals seemed to have developed a resistance to yellow fever. And when the next outbreak came, the only people who died from it was people who newly arrived, and they started to call it the stranger's disease. Malaria was also, it always was a major problem. Not as deadly as yellow fever, but malaria continued to be a problem. In fact, they called it the county fever. It was so common. And it was common right up until the 1950s when the use of pesticides stopped it out. The American Revolution comes along. As Matthew said, the Charleston was captured, it was occupied for about a year. And then really Charleston came in its own in that period, the antebellum period, from the Revolution through to the start of the Civil War. This is where Charleston really boomed. It had the growth of cotton, primarily because of the British Industrial Revolution, the cotton gin being developed, the insatiable demand for cotton, and plantations developed phenomenally. And sadly, and we touched on the slavery issue, Charleston became the slavery centre of the world. There's a quote somewhere, a guy wrote a book about it, saying he described Charleston as the Jerusalem of slavery. It was the centre of the faith of slavery. They estimate that something like 40 to 50% of all slaves coming into America came through the port of Charleston. But however, incredible wealth was created, and Matthew actually mentioned, it was actually a black majority city. And in fact, it continued to be that up until the mid-1800s. It was, in fact, past the Civil War. It was still a black majority city. But the city was controlled very much by a very small number of wealthy landowners. Civil War breaks out. And in fact, we'll get down to the harbour and talk about it, but the Civil War started basically in Charleston, and pretty much towards the end of it, when General Sherman was making his push towards the Atlantic, pretty well wiping out everything in his path, the Confederates evacuated the city of Charleston, burnt most of the public buildings and their supplies, and the Federals took over, occupied the city in February 1865, with the end of the Civil War not soon after. The postbellum period, basically in the Reconstruction period, 1865 through to 1945, the city, look, it took until the 1880s, 1870s, 1880s industry to come back and for industry came, but really Charleston was in a bit of period of decline until the Second World War. It became a major naval port. And then since the Second World War, the contemporary period, the city has blossomed and boomed. It's become a high-tech centre. We'll just cross over now, see where Matthew's got up to.
Right, so you can see a nice shot of the sunset going down behind St. Michael's Church. But we're going to turn in here just for a moment into an area known as Washington Square. One of the many pretty green spaces in Charleston. The city was planned, so there are lots of green spaces in the inner city. But this one has a kind of a complex history associated with it too, like everything in Charleston, really. But it's a good opportunity to talk about how modern Charleston is still struggling to come to terms in some ways with its past. This park has 3 monuments in it. All of those monuments are dedicated to Civil War figures. This bust that you see coming before us right now is dedicated to Henry Timrod, who was a Confederate poet. The large obelisk behind it is a monument to various soldiers who were from Charleston who died in the Civil War. And then there's a little niche to the side that you can see, which is a monument to P.G.T. Beauregard, who was the general who commanded the defense of Charleston during the Civil War. Now, you might have heard or you might have seen in the news that Confederate monuments are very controversial in the South, because although a lot of whites in the South can trace ancestry back to Confederate soldiers, one way or the other, really every able-bodied man in the South at a certain point was serving in the Confederate Army. Obviously, what they fought for is very controversial. The meaning of what they fought for has changed as historical opinion has shifted. And so whether you should have public displays of Confederate monuments is a very difficult issue in the city, in all great southern cities. Stuart can throw up a slide showing images of a Confederate monument that was defaced just a few months ago during the Black Lives Matters protests as a monument to the Confederate defenders of the city. Another monument to John C. Calhoun was pulled down by Charleston City Council only 6 weeks ago. So this is still part of living history about how you commemorate them. And even this little monument to P.G.T. Beauregard, and I put a picture of him on the slide, is a really complicated issue, because Beauregard was one of the few Confederate generals who, after the Civil War, recanted his beliefs in white supremacy and actively tried to improve civil rights and relationships with African Americans in his home state of New Orleans. So even Beauregard's own legacy has shifted, changed over the years. And so there's some consternation about whether he should be remembered for his later works promoting civil rights, or whether his life should be remembered mostly for his earlier defense of white supremacy and as a general for the Confederacy. So these issues are still ongoing in the South. There is no easy answer to a lot of them. One thing, though, to remember about a city like Charleston is that although it was a major slavery center and there were hundreds of thousands living here in the hinterlands before the Civil War, they were owned by a very small percentage of the population. Most white people in the South did not own slaves. They couldn't afford such luxuries. Most of them were poor laborers. In some ways, they had more in common with their enslaved African Americans than they did the white aristocracy. Charleston was a very socially stratified city with a very small elite who owned most of the property and most of the slaves. And so within a city like Charleston, most people will trace their ancestry back to poor whites rather than the southern gentry. And so that also kind of adds a layer of complexity to the Confederate memorial debate, because a lot of people feel like they don't have necessarily the same connection to a slavery holding past as the very small minority of the city does. As we exit this square, we're going to walk up to this grand Greek Revival temple, which is known as Hibernian Hall. There are numerous halls around Charleston that were constructed for the express purposes of meeting places for local societies. Society life was big in antebellum Charleston. If you were an able-bodied white man of any means, middle class or upper class, then you belonged to a fraternal order or society that were kind of socially ranked unofficially in the city. The Hibernians, of course, were the Irish descendants of the city. The Irish have a fairly large Catholic contingent here in the city, and so Hibernian Hall was their grand meeting place. Irish would play a big role in the politics of the city after the Civil War, but even before the Civil War, they had the money and the influence to build this enormous Greek Revival temple. You will have noticed a lot of the architecture that we've seen so far in Charleston does have classical elements. Greek Revival, which was very popular in the 2 decades before the Civil War in the South, there's a very specific political reason why they use it. Because Greece, ancient Greece, as the Southerners saw it, was both a democracy and a slaveholding society. And so to them, emulating the Greeks was what they were doing here. They were cities of learning and culture, of intellect and philosophy, but they also had slavery, which the Greeks thought were part of the natural order, and so did white Southerners. And so even the architecture kind of tells a story about the politics of the pre-Civil War period. But this building is also quite important because it's the scene of the beginning of the Civil War in lots of ways. In 1860, the Democrats met here in the city to choose their presidential candidate, as we are doing this year in the United States. So the Democratic National Convention was held here initially. The convention was fiercely divided over the issue of slavery. They couldn't come to an agreement on the position they were going to take to the election. So in the end, the Democrats split into three factions. They basically, decided to nominate three separate candidates. They staged separate conventions at three different buildings in the city. And as a result of that split in the party, the vote was split nationally of the Democrats, and the Republican candidate, Abraham Lincoln, won the overall election with only 40% of the vote. And so because of what happened in this hall, you have the beginning of the end of the original Union of the United States, because shortly after that, South Carolina makes the decision that Abraham Lincoln is inimical to the interests of the state and chooses to secede. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we walk on. I also want to point out the pink large hotel to the left of this building, or to the right, in fact, which is the Mills Hotel. Insofar as this is kind of the limit of the original heritage part of Charleston, because everything further on up the street here was destroyed during the Union bombardment of the city during the Civil War. Stuart can throw up some slides showing you photographs that were taken at the end of the Civil War from the roof of the Mills Hotel. And they show a devastated city. Everything was kind of destroyed on that street. The reason this particular area was almost flattened was because St. Phillips Church, that church that we originally started our tour in front of, St. Phillips Church was used by the Union Navy to train their gun sites. And so basically their shells were being fired at the church's steeple, going right over it and hitting the land immediately behind it. And so that was largely flattened. Fortunately, the rest of the city was largely spared, but there was an awful lot of destruction in the northern and northwestern parts of the city, so much so that they had to evacuate more or less the entire city before the Union finally overcame it in 1865. Now we're going to walk a little bit beyond the Hibernian Hall towards an area known as the Four Corners of Law. As we're walking, I'll explain kind of why it got that name. It's the center of the public institutions and legal institutions of the city. You can see already the steeple of this big white church, St. Michael's Church, which represents the law of God. You can see a dark grey building at the far corner on the other side, which is the federal courthouse, therefore the law of the federal government. This large white building with sandstone ornamentation in front of that federal building is the county courthouse, so law of the county. And then on the far opposite corner, which we'll turn around and face in a minute, is the City Hall of Charleston, so the law of the city. So this area, the Four Corners of Law, is home, still kind of considered the traditional center point of the city, although today the development of the city has moved far up the peninsula, and so this is not really the technical center of the city any longer. There's two buildings in particular that I want to focus on, and bear with us as we just cross the street in order to get there and contend with the bells of St. Michael's. But the building on the opposite, yeah, the church bell too. Well, there's a lot of churches in Charleston. The building on the opposite corner, this building, the County Courthouse, is one of the more influential designs in early colonial United States architecture. It was done by an Irish architect named James Hoban, who had emigrated here from Ireland during the colonial period. He's using here something that we generally call the federal style. It's really a Georgian style with a couple of classical elements thrown into it. It was very popular around the time of the American Revolution. So fusing the kind of architecture of England with the designs of ancient Greece to indicate the sort of more democratic leanings. So you can see some Ionic columns and the kind of crown molding on the pediment up there. Anyway, this building building was important. Firstly, it's inspired by Leinster House, and I think I have a slide there that shows Leinster House in Ireland, which is where the Irish Parliament sits today. So it came from that design, but it's important in American history because George Washington visited Charleston in 1791, and he saw the county courthouse and loved it. And so he invited James Hoban to come up to the newly established Washington, D.C. And design the White House. And so in the end, the Charleston County Courthouse became the model for the White House. The only difference with the White House at the rear, really, is that the porte cochere, the Greek elements have sort of extended out to form a porte cochere. But the windows and a lot of the design elements are pretty much similar. James Hoban would also serve as a consulting architect on the United States Capitol and many other prominent buildings in Washington, D.C. But he made his start here in Charleston, so there are lots of eerily similar buildings to Washington, D.C. located here. The other building I'll point out on the far corner and talk about just a little bit is Charleston City Hall. It's done a little bit later than the county courthouse, and so we tend to call this the late federal or sometimes the Adamesque style. There are some differences. It gets more and more classical. There's more and more ornamentation layered on as the 1800s wears on. So this one has a lot of pilasters inspired by Greek and Roman architecture. It's a lot more elaborate, the ornamentation around the windows and staircases. This particular building, though, which was finished in 1804, becomes important in that story of the Civil War, which I started to tell. So after the 1860 election and Abraham Lincoln becomes president of the United States, there is a discussion in Charleston and in all southern states about what to do. Abraham Lincoln, although not advocating the end of the slave trade immediately, is nevertheless from the Republican Party, which is broadly anti-slavery. As a result, the southern states do not believe that there is any chance of them long-term being able to preserve slavery and their peculiar way of life in a country that's ruled by the Republicans. So South Carolina is the first state to meet formally in the state capital of Columbia to discuss breaking away from the United States and forming their own independent country. They do that initially in Columbia, which is a few hours upstate, that is the state capital. But as it happens, there's an outbreak of cholera there. And so they decide so as not to, so they could practice proper social distancing and not infect everyone, that they'll move the state assembly down to South Carolina, to Charleston, in order to discuss the matter further. And so they do. They meet in the Charleston City Hall in December of 1860, and they formally pass a motion to secede from the United States. The Charleston Mercury carries the headline, the most famous headline perhaps of American history: "The Union is dissolved." The Charleston Mercury publishes just down the street from here still today. And so that was really the beginning of the Civil War, though it would be some months until fighting breaks out between the newly formed Confederate States and the Union, or the old United States. The beginning is the end. 10 other southern states will join South Carolina eventually in seceding from the Union. So we're going to walk now down into one of the historic residential districts of Charleston. We've kind of gone through some of the civic centers, but really Charleston's, I think, true treasures are to be found in its residential areas. It has an extraordinary number, about 1,400 historic houses that have been preserved one way or the other over the years. There's very strict covenants placed on these districts, and it was the first area in the United States to have a historic heritage code overlaid on the neighborhood. 1931 was when the first heritage laws were passed in South Carolina, and that was the first for the United States as a whole. One of the buildings I'll point out as we come through here is the one with the large flag hanging down in front of it, which you can see, or might be able to see on camera, says the South Carolina Society. This is the South Carolina Society Hall. So like the Hibernian Hall, it's designed and built as a meeting place for one of those social clubs in Charleston. This one is for the descendants of the French Huguenots. So it's a French influenced society. Another very impressive example of Adamesque or late federal style architecture. This one kind of goes completely over the top with Greek elements. This portico that was added on in the 1920s kind of changes the look of it a little bit because it was more flat like federal style buildings initially. But this was kind of one of the most elite clubs to be part of because, of course, the Huguenots were one of the earliest occupants of the city. And so as a result, membership at this club is quite exclusive even today. You can't underestimate the importance of society, of family, of lineage in South Carolina, even today. I mean, the tradition of giving people double names or naming your son with with the mother's maiden surname. So you get unusual names like Preston Brooks and Dubose Hayward. These are all so that they include the names of two distinguished families in your lineage, or double-barreled names like Mary Clark or Laura Bell. These are indications of your ancestry. So people take that very seriously still in the South today. I also want to point out this house behind us, which is the Poyas Mordecai house, and I'll stand in front of it loosely. There's two reasons why I'll kind of go into this. The first is because of the inhabitants. So you might notice from the name Poyas Mordecai. Mordecai is a Jewish name, and there was a large Jewish contingent here in Charleston, South Carolina. It was one of the largest Jewish cities before New York became that after the Civil War. The Mordecai family were merchant sea captains. Pretty much everyone living in this street or around in this neighborhood before the Civil War probably had something to do with the maritime trade, or perhaps they were a plantation owner who had a city house as well. But most likely they were involved in the merchant trade. The Mordecai family were no exception. They were Jewish sea captains. Moses Mordecai, the patron of the family before the Civil War, was against succession. He actually advocated for South Carolina to stay in the Union. But after succession occurred, he decided to help the Confederate effort as much as he could. So he became a blockade runner. Blockade running is a really fascinating aspect of Charleston's history. Obviously, it was fairly brief, just over the course of the Civil War. But very quickly into the early Civil War, the port of Charleston was blockaded. The Union had a large navy, much larger than the Confederacy, and so they just sat the ships out off the coast and prevented anything from coming in and out. This was known as the Anaconda Plan. Basically, they wanted the Navy to be a big, large snake that would eventually strangle the South and deny them any supplies. So Mordecai becomes a blockade runner, and they buy very fast ships that they hope will be able to outrun the Union lines. And I think on one of the slides, we have an image of blockade runner. So Mordecai, this is a picture of one of his, the CSS Annie. It's a side-wheel steamer, so faster than the average Union gunboat. And they would engage in the very dangerous task of trying to get to Europe, mostly England or France, to trade cotton and other things that they traded before the war with these two countries, and bring back necessary supplies for the Confederate cause. Except this isn't really how it always happened. If you've ever seen Gone with the Wind, Rhett Butler is a blockade runner, and they constantly mention, there's a low social standing and some of the problems of blockade running. The principal one being they didn't come back from France and England all the time with heavy cannons and gunpowder and things that the Confederate Army needed. They came back with silk, and they came back with chocolates, and they came back with other luxuries that could sell and make a fortune off these blockade runs, which made the Mordecai family very, very wealthy, but didn't really help the Confederate war effort very much. The second reason I'm going to point out this house is because of its architecture. It is a classic of what they call the Charleston single house. So if you look at it carefully, you should be able to see that the front door in this house is a false door. It doesn't actually lead to the interior of the house. It leads onto the piazza, this large, open, colonnaded area to the side of the house. This is necessary in the sweltering nature of Charleston's weather. It's 30 degrees right now, and the sun is down. It's the middle of October, so we're in the fall, and it's still really hot here. And so you would need this house to have this large open piazza and every room in the house to open up on the piazza to maximize airflow and make it bearable. The other kind of distinctive aspect of the Charleston single house is it's quite long. It extends back from the block rather than having most of its frontage on the street. Charleston's city blocks are quite long and thin, and there's a practical reason for that, mostly because of the role of slavery. When you had a building like this, generally on the street side, you had the formal rooms and the formal kind of entryway and everything that was sort of polite and socially facing. And then towards the rear of the block, you'd have what known as the dependencies, and these were the kitchens and the slave quarters and all sorts of other things that eminent Charlestonians had. And so they were tucked way back from the street. So these long, thin blocks gave rise to these long, thin houses. And you will see lots of Charleston single houses as we walk around the residential district. They can be done in any style. You'll have Georgian, you'll have Federal, you'll have Adamesque, you'll have Victorian, you'll have a mishmash of house style, but most of the houses in this area will conform to this general design because it made the most sense for both climate and for the social expectations of the era. We are going to walk just a little bit further to Trad Street, but I can take a question now, Stuart, if you want, while we're making that transition.
Just to allow you to have a bit of a breather, Matthew, because you've been going at 100 miles an hour. I'll just quickly show. Yeah, okay. I'll quickly show everybody the route that we're taking in the city, so it gives everyone a bit of an idea of where we've come. So we started out at St. Phillips Church, come down to that French Quarter, the Slave Mart. That's got to be one of the most fascinating things there. Down to Washington Square, the park with the memorials, the four corners of law. And now we're heading down this historic house district, and we'll be making our way down through the historic house district, down through and down. We'll be finishing the harbour and the battery. One of the questions that did come up, obviously Savannah and Charleston are quite often interspersed with each other. Are they both very typical, the same, or are they very different cities?
No, they're actually really different cities. Sterling and I were just down in Savannah just before we came up here. Very loud car. Savannah's history is actually, early history is really quite different. It was founded by a man named James Oglethorpe, and it was part of this philanthropic exercise to create a perfect new colony. And so in doing so, what they did, they banned slavery, they banned alcohol and rum, and they actually, it was sort of like almost like a Puritan settlement in its first 20 years. It was also a completely planned city. So all of Savannah is laid out on a series of squares and plazas around which are the public buildings and then the houses in big rings. It's a very distinctive city. So when you go in there, it's beautiful. There's huge open squares in the middle of every block. So the design is quite different. The feel is quite different, even though obviously they did eventually introduce slavery into Savannah, and alcohol, kind of crept in pretty quickly. Nevertheless, like the origin stories are quite different, and so the architecture, the style, even the culture of the two cities is pretty different, even though they are very close and you can visit them. It's only a couple of hours to drive down to Savannah from here. Yeah, they do actually feel quite different, and the histories are quite different too. So we're walking right now down a little alley known as Trad Street. And this, believe it or not, 150 years ago, were the slums of Charleston. So a lot of African Americans, if they were domestic slaves, they would have lived on site in one of those single houses, either in the attic or in dependency out the back. But as I mentioned, there are lots of African Americans in the city, enslaved, who worked in domestic laundries or kitchens, or in other areas in which you weren't necessarily attached to a house. And so they were put in tenements or large slums, sometimes right in the middle of which, housing areas, because of course there's no public transport in Charleston, you have to put them somewhere close to their jobs. And so these buildings, which have now been beautifully gentrified into little apartment blocks and all sorts of things, this was the poorest of the poor before the Civil War. The area, I guess, comes to prominence a little bit in modern literary and musical history, because in 1925, Dubose Hayward, who lives in this area, writes a novel called Porgy in 1925 about a character who lives in this area on Trad Street, or just a little bit up on Church, around the corner from here, in a building just like this one. Porgy is one of the first pieces of literature that kind of depicts African Americans in a positive light, or at least not an overtly negative, stereotypical light. Porgy would become the source material for Gershwin's Porgy and Bess. In most of Porgy and Bess's productions, they try and recreate, in a way, the feeling of how this street and this area would have looked when Porgy was written. Now, of course, it doesn't really look anything like that. It's been a little bit controversial in recent years because this was once such an important African-American area of the city. Now very few live here because of gentrification. We know the story of gentrification in Sydney and other places where high prices drive out the traditional working classes. And so that's certainly happened in this area. And so there's been some attempts over the years to try and create more affordable housing so that the racial and socioeconomic makeup of the city is more similar to its earlier history. But so far, that hasn't been hugely successful. House prices are quite high in Charleston. Another house I'm just going to bring us up to around the corner here, just to give you an example of the very earliest style of architecture in this area, and one of which there is not a lot of examples left. This is the Hayward Washington House. It's called the Hayward Washington House because this is the house that George Washington stayed in during his famous tour of the city in 1791. And so they've capitalized on that reputation ever since. It is a classic example of what architecture looked like in the city before the British left, which is essentially Georgian architecture. So you can kind of see how some of those later buildings just took the classic British Georgian style and added classical elements onto it to create the Federal and the Adam S styles. The Hayward Washington House is absolutely stunning inside. It has some of the most valuable colonial furniture in the country, including the most valuable bookcase in America, the Holmes bookcase. Some young crew tried to rob it in the 1990s. You can see that massive bookcase. I don't know what they were thinking, but they tried to break in and steal it in the 1990s. Didn't quite succeed. And then out the back of the Hayward Washington House, which we also have an image of, you can see what an original colonial era garden or allotment looked like behind one of these houses. And this also gives you a sense of how long and how large the lots are here in Charleston. Not a lot of houses still maintain those kind of gardens and allotments. As a result, they've been filled in, and progressively the city's become more dense over time. But initially, it's like a little mini plantation. You have a large open garden at the back and the ability to grow all sorts of things to use in your kitchens and all sorts of outhouses to do your kind of domestic duties in. So the Hayward Washington House is a really kind of good, pristine example of what the very earliest houses in Charleston look like. We're going to take just a little bit more of a leisurely walk now towards the harbour through the residential district. Sterling with his camera work can hopefully capture as many of the houses, because you really can't turn anywhere in this area without casting your eyes upon a historic house of one night thought or the other. We are running out of light, but hopefully you'll get just enough, and you can see the flickering even of some gas lamps which are still left running in some houses.
Matthew, sorry, I just thought I noticed that just as you walked past that previous house. It was actually a true gas lamp burning, or was it just the
Yeah. Oh, wow. Sterling's going to go right up to one now. We've just found one on another single house. Yep, some people still just have.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. Oh,
we were commenting actually the other night as we were walking through the city how this makes it some streets very poorly lit in Charleston. We're not exactly sure how they get away with it, because even to drive down a gaslit street is pretty hairy. But anyway, it's obviously grandfathered in or something.
Yeah. And we've had a very Australia typical question when you mentioned that the houses are very expensive in Charleston. What sort of money are we talking about, the prices of the houses?
Right. So obviously in preparation, we looked all into this, because in case Sterling and I want to retire here.
No, I think it's more Australians are just obsessed about real estate. Yeah.
Right. So one of these houses, a Charleston single house, like the ones we're walking around right now, these are in the range of $1.5 to $2.5 million US. So not outrageous, although by American standards that is quite high. A lot of Americans would think that made it a very pricey city, but maybe by Australian standards, that's a car park. But
yeah. It's beautiful, the streetscape, and it is with the dusk. It's great images.
The residents obviously take a lot of pride in their city and the historic nature of it, and a lot of these areas are placed under homeowner association covenants. So when you move in here, you have to make all sorts of agreements and sign all sorts of contracts about what you're going to do with your house, and what you're allowed to do with it or not. And some of them are very strict. You can't have curtains, for example, that are pink. They've got to be white or taupe, or they'll give you a list of colors. You can have your door and have your shutters and all sorts of things. So they take it very seriously. You're not allowed to kind of stray too far from the kind of official designations from the Homeowner Association. So we're going to walk down an alleyway that goes into the center of one of these blocks, so you can kind of see what the back end or the middle of a Charleston block looks like, and how they've been filled in as house prices have gone up, and some of the allotments at the back disappeared. So you can see here, for example, this little house obviously isn't part of the historical landscape, but oh, we've got a dog barking at us. There's the beauty of live on site for you. Fortunately, this is a public alleyway. We're not quite trespassing, although we would do anything for our clients, obviously, including trespass, but maybe not in South Carolina. One thing we were commenting on yesterday is that you'll notice, even though we're in the middle of an election period, and there's a lot of yard signs around in other suburbs, they're not really allowed in the historic district. They try and keep politics to one side. So this is a covenant placed down by a lot of the residents' communities and the residents' committees to try and maintain amicable relations between the neighbours. They won't allow it. So we're going to pop down the last of this little alleyway, and we should come out Harbourside.
So has there been a lot of development, like for instance, as we do in Australia, like subdividing the backyard and selling off to build a second house?
So some of the little buildings you saw there really are just granny flats, things that have been taken off the main lot and rented out. Like students will live in little kind of houses at the back of the big lots. So yeah, a lot of them have been subdivided. If you look from Google Maps, you can zoom in and you'll see there's not that many that maintain the massive backyards.
Yeah. But they do have to recreate, keep it in the same sympathetic style as the historic houses.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really quite serious here, and that's been going on for 80-90 years, and that's kind of why Charleston is so well preserved, just because of the sheer length of time that heritage ordinances have been maintained. There was a very long-term mayor of the city, famous Charlestonian named John Riley, and he became mayor of the city in 1976, and he served 10 terms and only retired in 2016. So 40 years in control of Charleston. And he was a huge advocate of heritage and protection of the city. And really, it's kind of, he was a sort of a benign dictator of the city that, was more than anyone responsible for protecting the city from developers, especially in the 70s and 80s when there was a lot of pressure to knock down old buildings and build up waterfront condos and apartment buildings and things like that. So, Riley, more than anyone, is responsible for kind of keeping the city as it was as much as he could. And so as a result, there's very little development in the city even today, and now all of this stuff is locked down. But the residents themselves, as I said, also enforce it. They, have a kind of vested interest in keeping keeping Charleston as it was in the antebellum era. This is a unique thing in the United States, and so they want to hold on to it as much as possible. Anyway, we've finally reached Charleston Harbour, the whole reason the city is here, the source of its early prosperity, this large natural harbour, still the 5th largest port in the Americas, so still an important kind of maritime. You can see various ships and things docked out there, or you might be able to. The light is obviously fading very quickly now.
Actually, Matthew, I'll just share them a Google an image of the harbour, so it gives everyone a bit of perspective of just how big the harbour is. And you see the historic Charleston downtown area, which is where we've just been walking through with Matthew. And quite interesting, that mayor, Joseph Riley Waterfront Park, they named the park after him, and the battery down on the point. And you see this confluence of the two rivers, the Ashley River and the Cooper River, flowing into this large harbour, which is naturally protected, a narrow opening of the harbour. And Matthew would probably be talking about the very famous Fort Sumter, which is out here at the entrance to the harbour.
That map is very helpful because you can see there's a narrow neck which leads into the harbour, which was traditionally the site of very important fortifications. Initially, most of them were constructed to protect from the French, the Spanish, and pirates. Fort Moultrie, which is on the north side, Fort Sumter, which is on a small island right in the middle of, and then Castle Pinckney, which is a little bit further inlet on a larger island, just a little bit closer to Savannah. These were major naval fortifications during the 1700s. The British maintained them, then the Americans. Fort Sumter, though, is the most important one. It's right smack bang in the middle of the harbour. You can only just very vaguely make it out. I don't even think, with the light fading as it is, you'll be able to see it, but it's sort of out in the distance there. There's a couple of lights on it for navigational purposes that you can kind of see at night. Fort Sumter, right in the middle of the harbour, became the flashpoint that started the actual shooting aspect of the American Civil War. As I said, in December of 1860, just downtown there, South Carolina has seceded from the United States. 10 other states have joined them. The Confederacy have been formed. But there isn't any actual war going on at this time. That's okay. Live on site. So there isn't actually any fighting. There's a tense standoff between the federal government and the newly formed Confederate states. There is a period of negotiation where President Buchanan and then President Lincoln, who takes office in 1861, feel that they might be able to negotiate a solution or end, the conflict or dispute without actually going into war. But the kind of sticking point becomes Fort Sumter. It's maintained, a facility maintained by the U.S. Federal Army. But of course, they're surrounded now completely by the newly formed Confederate state of South Carolina. So in order to keep the fort in supply, the Union Army must send ships down to South Carolina to supply them with food and powder, all sorts of things. The Confederate Army is increasingly annoyed by this. They want Fort Sumter to be handed over to the South Carolina State Militia because it is on South Carolina's land. This is a step to which the federal government is unwilling to go, and eventually fighting breaks out in April of 1861, the famous Battle of Fort Sumter, in which the fort is bombarded from all sides by those other forts on the South Carolina land side. The battle only lasts a couple of days. The federal garrison is forced to surrender, and so it's the first victory for the Confederacy and the beginning of the war formally. And so, for all sorts of reasons, Charleston really is, the focal point, the center of the early Civil War. Obviously, it's destruction at the end of it, and in a lot of ways, because Charleston is so devastated by the war and its economy takes so long to recover after the war, it really loses its status as the premier southern city to other cities that arise and rebuild after the war. Cities like Atlanta, New Orleans, even to some extent Memphis and Nashville and Tennessee, these become much larger urban industrial centers after the war. So Charleston is kind of a city trapped in the past or stuck in the past. It didn't develop a lot after the Civil War, and it sort of lost its prominence. But that's also kind of part of its charm. You can actually walk through the city and see what a pre-Civil War city looked like by and large, because so little of development occurred in those critical decades after the war. The area we're standing on now along the waterfront is where the very richest of the rich live in South Carolina. This is the area known as the Battery. The Battery has all of the largest houses built by eminent Charlestonians before the Civil War, and we can probably finish our tour right in front of the most expensive house in Charleston, so you can really get a good handle on real estate prices. It hasn't got any lights on it though, so I don't know how much we'll be able to see. Hopefully the phone can adjust to the low lighting, but it's this one that's kind of coming into view right now. It has both a square and a rounded frontage around its porticos. It's called the Poichet House, and it sold in June of this year for $7.7 million, making it the most expensive house in Charleston. But I think we're running out of light, Stuart. It seems to be getting very dark.
No. So just seeing you could buy a one-bedroom unit in Sydney for about the same price. So yeah.
There you go. Exactly right. So if you want to move to Charleston, it's still very doable for a lot of Australians. Well, and there are some, like this house next to the Poichet house, that are badly needed of a generous person to buy it up and restore it. This is, I mean, you're taking on a lifetime work by doing it, because you'll have all sorts of restrictions on what you can do. But as you know, the outcome can be very pretty.
In fact, that one, it looks very similar style to that single block house you were showing us earlier on, the Mordecai single block.
Right. Yeah, they'll still usually have the piazza, the open piazza on the side. That's still, the most practical way, even for the largest houses, to cool the house and maintain air circulation, and to have your mint juleps in the afternoon. So yeah, that's most of even the largest mansions will still have that kind of single house design to it.
Yeah, that's it. And look, obviously the one topic that is very raised up quite a bit today about the politics, mainly because coming out with the election, we've got 3 weeks to go to the election. Is Charleston a Democrat or Republican city?
Yeah, that's a complicated question to answer. The Mayor Joseph Riley, mayor for 40 years, was a Democrat. His successor is also a Democrat. But what Democrat means in the South is not what it means in the North. The Democrats in the South tend to be more socially conservative than their compatriots in the North. So, a Southern Democrat would probably have not as much in common with Anastasio Ocasio-Cortez or one of the kind of famous northern politicians, Democratic politicians these days. A Southern Democrat would probably be conservative on things like abortion, on things like affirmative action, on things like gun rights. They're most likely to take more socially conservative positions than you'd expect for a Democrat in the United States. But yes, Charleston would probably consider itself as nominally a Democratic city. However, it would be not unusual for them to vote for a Democratic mayor here and then vote for President Trump in the federal election. In fact, that's what's happened a lot in South Carolina in recent years. They might vote for a legislature who's a Southern Democrat or a governor who's a Southern Democrat, but nationally, because the politics of the United States is different at the national level and the Democrats are further to the left nationally than they are here in the South, they would probably vote for Republican president. So it'll be split. You'll see Trump signs matched with the Democratic mayor's sign here in South Carolina pretty easily.
Okay, so it's a real mix-up. So at the moment, is the state, South Carolina, is it a Democrat state or a Republican state?
It's a Republican state.
Yeah,
it's a Republican state through and through. The tradition, I think it's been a long time since South Carolina has voted for a Democrat. It's closer, though, than other southern states because you still have a very large African-American population in South Carolina. Still 30% or so of the population are African-American. It means that the Democrats are kind of completely counted out. There are some, southern states, which like West Virginia, which have almost no African-Americans living in it, so they'd be much more Republican. South Carolina, they are still competitive, but it's still considered a Republican state.
Yeah, and that leads into one of the questions we've been asked. Around the time of the Civil War, with the high proportion of African-American residents, did this include many free slaves? Were there free slaves?
No, it was very uncommon. There were about 2% of all African Americans living in the South before the Civil War were free. It was very difficult to become free in the South before the Civil War, even if your master manumitted you at death, which is obviously a great tradition. It was usually overruled by the local authorities because they wanted to maintain control over the African American population at all costs. And so, laws were set up basically to prevent even slaves who were freed by their masters from ever really becoming free. Usually the only way you could become free, properly free as a slave person in the South before the Civil War was buying your own freedom. And a very small proportion of highly skilled slaves, so some skills were highly demanded in the South, things like blacksmithing, coopering, wheeling. Some African Americans would get a trade in that, and they might make enough money because their skills are worth enough to then buy their own freedom. That was pretty much it, but that's a tiny percentage that were able to do that. So when the Civil War rolled around, almost no free blacks were living in the city, and they had a huge humanitarian crisis when the city was captured, because you had hundreds of thousands of African Americans, suddenly refugees essentially in their own country, and the Union Army had to deal with that.
Yeah, and post-Civil War, with the great migration to the north, to the industrial cities, did that affect Charleston, or did? Yeah,
so Charleston's black population has steadily decreased since the Civil War. As I said, it was about 60% in 1850, 1860 when the Civil War began. Today, only about 25% of the city is African American. So it's a fairly large drop. After the Civil War, especially towards the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, hundreds of thousands of African Americans left South Carolina and the South to move up to the north to get jobs in factories and whatnot. Only in the last 20 years, there's a phenomenon that's been called the New Great Migration, where those numbers have started to change. And partly it's because race relations in the north, in some large urban areas in the north, are actually declining compared to the South. So Black Lives Matter and a lot of the protests around George Floyd and a lot of the police, shootings of African Americans, they've occurred in large northern cities like Minneapolis and Madison and Milwaukee. And so, ironically, there's been a net increase in the amount of African Americans living in the South in the last 10, 15 years. So sociologists are studying this right now about why they're moving back here. And of course, a lot of African American families, their roots are in the South. So it kind of makes sense for them to move back here, perhaps in the long term. So Charleston's black population is actually slowly increasing after almost a century of decrease.
Just another question we've had, and I think I can answer this pretty quick. Well, I hope I can answer this correctly. Just a question about the gas lighting in the house. That was just facade on the external. It's not the internal of the house would be gaslit as well.
It would be a very dedicated, preservationist who would live through gaslighting. Look, I mean, it's America. Someone will be doing that. But no, that's just, it's facade. It's an aesthetic touch, yeah.
Okay, and look, and again, because we are in such a restricted lockdown period here in Australia, it's kind of interesting to see, and we hear a lot about America. With COVID, restaurants, is it back open as normal, or is it outdoor dining only? How much do you think it's affected, like Charleston, the COVID restrictions?
So it differs so much even from state to state. Sterling and I have driven across 3 states as part of, coming up here. And it's really fascinating how every city implements. I mean, this is America, the land of local democracy. So you get just a patchwork of different rules depending on where you are. In Charleston, nominally, everyone on the street should be wearing a mask. This is actually everything public in the city should be masked, but no one is obeying it, as far as we can see. Inside any restaurant in building, you're expected to wear a mask. In our hotel, in the lobby, we wear a mask. So there are those kind of expectations placed on indoor public areas, but outdoors, you can see if no one's really wearing a mask. Certainly, all restaurants are more or less open. We've seen restaurants, that have tables earmarked for not being sat at, because of COVID social distancing. So half the tables will have chairs on them saying they can't be used. And then we've been in there and the restaurant started to fill up and suddenly those tables are opened up. So I would say that, to the extent it's being enforced, it varies quite a lot. And that's probably reflected in the massive numbers of COVID infections here. This is just the way the Americans have decided to do it. Most people are surprisingly unconcerned about it. So what can you say?
All right. Well, it's obviously getting very dark there.
Yes.
I can understand. I found that apparently Travel and Leisure magazine in 2016 voted Charleston as the best city in the world. And apparently consistently for the past 2 decades, it's rated as one of the top 5 US cities. And after your short tour today, I can understand why. It's a beautiful city. I feel I've actually spent time there in Charleston myself. So thank you, Matthew, so much.
No problem. I'm glad I was able to share it with you.
what is a delightful city and with amazing history as well. That's what makes it so great. So thank you very much, and thank you to Sterling. Wonderful job. So thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.